Today we look at the fourth of Jesus' Beatitudes, where he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." That's in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verse 6. And I've entitled my talk, "Do the Right Thing." The fourth of Jesus' Beatitudes connects with all of us because to varying degrees we all know what it is to hunger and thirst. Hunger and thirst are a universal experience regardless of the richness or the poverty of our souls. Even though I've never seriously considered eating a horse or been close to dying from thirst, even if I said I was, I have been hungry and thirsty enough that I had trouble thinking of anything else. The all-consuming presence that hunger and thirst bring is what makes Jesus' words so compelling. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Reflect back to your own intense experiences with being hungry and thirsty, and I think you will agree that few things in life arouse as much desperation as hunger and thirst. We see the demanding nature of hunger and thirst illustrated in the universal expression of hospitality, to offer something to drink and a bite to eat. As we consider Jesus' words, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," it's helpful to keep the intensity we've experienced with hunger and thirst in mind. Even though we all relate to hunger and thirst, we normally connect those conditions with items we are used to craving. Since Jesus obviously wasn't talking about hunger and thirst for food and drink, it's worth taking an inventory of our regular cravings, our regular hungers and thirsts. Where do dreams about being healthier, stronger, thinner, attractive, wealthier, braver, accomplished, respected, famous, where do all these things fit on your list of hungers? Did righteousness make your list? I think Jesus understood that righteousness wasn't going to sit high up in the list of qualities for which we hunger. In fact, we might not even have a well-defined sense of what righteousness means, which is unfortunate because righteousness is one of the most central concepts in the Bible. We could even go as far as to say that a lack of righteousness is the whole motivation behind God's mission as it's laid out in the Bible. No wonder Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." So, what's the big deal about righteousness? The word righteousness can be intimidating, as illustrated by the fact that it takes up massive amounts of space in theological books. At the risk of oversimplifying the discussion of righteousness, I'm going to suggest that there are two foundational meanings of righteousness in the Bible, which result from two different perspectives. The first perspective about righteousness is as a legal description where a person is declared righteous or blameless, meaning that they are judged to be not guilty for an offense. In a court of law, when a judge pronounces someone to be not guilty, we could say that person is being judged righteous or blameless. Unfortunately, our human dilemma and the central problem which the Bible addresses is that none of us are blameless, and instead are all blameworthy. According to the very simple words of Romans 3, verse 10, there is no one righteous, not even one. Because we are all blameworthy and not blameless, God, in his grace, created a way for our debt of blame to be paid. This is of course, why Jesus entered human history. Jesus' death paid the price of our blame, and as we claim Jesus' redemptive work on our behalf through faith, God places a judgment of righteous or blameless on our legal account. Because of our faith in Jesus, God declares that we are now legally blameless, righteous. If you've ever heard the theological term imputed righteousness, this is what it's talking about. Imputed righteousness means that God knows that we are horrible, blameworthy people, but God says, that's okay. Because of Jesus, I forgive you. You're off the hook. You are now legally judged to be righteous. The second perspective of righteousness is very different and is not based on legality, but on practicality. If the first perspective of righteousness is dependent on whether or not we are legally viewed to be blameless, the second perspective of righteousness provides a practical motivation for how a person acts. The big question from a practical view of righteousness is no longer whether or not we are blameworthy, but how we act. For instance, 1 John chapter 2, verse 29 says, if you know that he, speaking of Jesus, if you know that Jesus is righteous, you know that everyone who does what is right has been born of him. Notice the connection between righteousness and doing what is right. Imparted righteousness means, I skipped here. This, in the theological world, this practical approach to righteousness is called imparted righteousness. Imparted righteousness means that our ethical conduct is governed by our inner righteousness so that we treat others rightly. A key question then, when we look at the fourth beatitude, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled, is this: of which perspective about righteousness was Jesus primarily thinking? Was Jesus thinking of the legal perspective from which God views us, or from the practical perspective with which we act? It's fair to say that we can't completely separate one perspective of righteousness from the other, but it does make a significant impact on how we interpret Jesus' words. Are we only hungering and thirsting for God's forgiveness, or do we hunger and thirst to do the right thing? How we interpret Jesus' intended view of the word righteousness ends up making a huge difference in how we live out our faith. If we are only concerned with imputed righteousness, with being judged blameless before God, there is really no need for our righteousness to grow beyond affirming that we have placed our faith in God's forgiveness. Our experience of following God ends up being a fairly shallow matter where we quickly affirm a few basic beliefs. I call that formula-based Christianity, where repeating certain prayers and agreeing to certain beliefs allows a person to claim that God has declared them righteous. If, on the other hand, we are concerned with imparted righteousness, with doing right, then there is no limit to the potential growth of our righteousness. From the perspective of imparted righteousness, to hunger and thirst after righteousness becomes a never-ending quest to correct injustice in the world around us. When we looked at the second beatitude where Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn," I suggested that we could define sin as the injustice we inflict on our world. According to that definition of sin, practical righteousness is the direct opposite. Practical righteousness means treating our world with justice. I don't think there's any doubt that Jesus was talking about the second perspective of righteousness. The whole Sermon on the Mount challenges us on how to practically live out our faith. Just a few statements later, Jesus connected righteousness with acting justly. And so in chapter 5, verse 20, just as I said, a few verses further along, Jesus said, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." The Pharisees were all about trying to impress others rather than about combating injustice. And then at the beginning of chapter 6, Jesus said, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." Note that phrase, practice your righteousness. Jesus was intent on teaching that while righteousness begins with God, it is intended to counter injustice in practical ways. The discussion about righteousness can sound very academic, and I hope you've been able to follow me on this. But it has immense impact on our lives. First of all, to hunger and thirst for righteousness will connect us to a God who is good. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness builds a bridge between a world that is not as it should be and a God who is intent on correcting that injustice. This means that hungering and thirsting for righteousness is instrumental in shaping our view of God. Too often we think of God's justice as the punishment God inflicts on disobedient people. And we end up viewing God as angry, maybe even as harsh. But punishment is not the Bible's primary approach to justice at all. The message of the Bible, right from Adam and Eve, is that God accomplishes justice by bringing an end to injustice. Jesus' mission was to end the injustice of sin separating people from God. God's intent to fight injustice is not to fight injustice with violence, but with just treatment. As Romans 12:21 famously puts it, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Hungering and thirsting for righteousness means that we will be ardent, that we will have a burning desire to bring good to a world that expects bad. And we will be connected to a God who accomplishes good. The flip side of connecting to a God who is intent on ending injustice is that we should take serious note of anywhere we fall on the wrong side of injustice. We can never afford to take lightly the issues of societal injustice because we can be sure that God does not. Romans 12, just before challenging us to overcome evil with good, reminds us in verse 19 to leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord." Hungering and thirsting for righteousness becomes a sober reminder that whenever we mock societal injustice, we are mocking a God who promises to avenge injustice. An important aspect of hungering and thirsting for righteousness, then, is educating ourselves about societal injustices around us. I shudder to think of the injustices to which I used to turn a blind eye, and maybe even participate in, but which also serve to remind me that there will be other injustices to which I am still not sensitive. It's always interesting that those who are victims of injustice have a very different view on use of language and imagery than those who have perpetuated the injustice. Those who hunger and thirst after righteousness will be the first to listen to those who have been treated with injustice. All-consuming hunger and thirst is never comfortable. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness will also not be comfortable. But hungering and thirsting for righteousness will unite us with a good God who is consumed with ending injustice.